Hi there. I am AI Assistant Gina for KGN News, Barbados.
And I am AI Assistant Kirk.
In this video, as we promised, we are going to talk about the debt component of the budget estimates. But before we do that, we want to point out to you and the authorities an error in the estimates. The error concerns that element of the budget that compares the current year with the previous year. When we compare the current year with the previous year, we can get a sense of whether budget items are increasing or decreasing, or whether that budget item is getting better or worse.
A comparison is made by subtracting the previous year from the current year. The difference is reported in the column with the heading Estimates 2026 to 2027 over Revised 2025 to 2026 as seen in Exhibit 1. In reviewing these figures, we found an error in the budget line called General Public Services. This is shown in Exhibit 2. The reported difference is negative $966,782,634. The negative sign indicates that the estimates for 2026 to 27 are lower by this amount. However, since the 2026 to 27 figure is greater than the 2025 to 26 amount, the reported negative difference cannot be correct. The correct figure is plus $82,636,948. This means that the expenditure on general public services will be greater in 2026 to 27, not less, by approximately $83 million.
We now look at how the Barbados government is planning to borrow to make up for the shortfall in revenue for government operations for 2026 to 27. That shortfall is $678,327,582, or approximately $700 million. Our presentation is based on Table 8 in the official estimates.
Government borrows from two major sources: international or foreign lenders and domestic or local lenders. Here is the breakdown in borrowing between these two sources for 2026 to 27. Among the foreign loans is one for $50 million from the Chinese Exim Bank, $41 million from the World Bank, and $100 million from the OPEC Fund for International Development.
In other news, President Donald Trump hosted a summit of the Americas in Miami on Saturday, March 7th. The purpose of the summit, entitled Shield of the Americas, is to build a multilateral alliance with governments aligned with U.S. interests, especially on the issues of security and migration. Kamla Persad-Bissessar of TNT, Dr. Ifraan Ali of Guyana, and President of the Dominican Republic, Luis Abinader, were the only Caribbean heads of government invited. Absent from the lineup of guests were the heads of state of Mexico, Colombia, Brazil, and Mia Mottley of Barbados, who recently won the February 2026 election in her country.
In his remarks at the conference, President Donald Trump has in effect put the communist regime in Cuba on the clock.
Well, we're also looking forward to the great change that will soon be coming to Cuba. Cuba's at the end of the line. They're very much at the end of the line. They have no money, they have no oil, they have a bad philosophy, they have a bad regime that's been bad for a long time. And they want to negotiate, and they are negotiating with Marco and myself and some other. And I would think a deal would be made very easily with Cuba. But for 50 years I've been hearing, as a little boy, I'm hearing about Cuba. Cuba's a disaster. But I've been hearing so much about Cuba. But Cuba's in its last moments of life, as it was. It'll have a great new life, but it's in its last moments of life the way it is.
It is not yet clear what arrangements are to be made to transition Cuba to a democratic state, but President Trump has indicated that negotiations are ongoing. In previous interviews, President Trump has indicated that Secretary of State Marco Rubio, a descendant of Cuban exiles, will be overseeing the transition or reset of Cuba. In our commentary section, Dr. Alden D. Tull will be examining the Cuba issue in more detail. This is AI Kirk and AI Gina for KGN News Barbados.
We are not going to sit here and pretend that we agree with everything the United States government has done to or against Cuba over the last 60 plus years since the 1959 revolution that brought Castro to power. Neither is it lost on us that part of the US antagonism to the Cuban Communist regime is the result of its humiliation in the failed, infamous CIA Bay of Pigs invasion of 1961 and the missile crisis of 1962. Blockades and sanctions do hurt, as the people of Iran and Russia can testify. But neither can we sit here and pretend that everything is okay in Cuba. Unlike us, the citizens of Cuba cannot vote in free and fair elections because they do not live in a democracy but have been the subjects of a one-party communist state since 1959. It is a point well made by Kamala Besessar, Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago, at the 50th Head of Governments meeting in St. Kitts. In the Caribbean, we have developed a decidedly hypocritical view of the world and our relationship to it. Apparently, it is all right for us to use the expertise of Cuban doctors, knowing full well that very little of what we pay them will ever reach their pockets. That is more acceptable than trying harder to fix the perennial problems in our health system. Some of our Caribbean leaders make it a point of going to the United Nations and talking about human rights, while at the same time stifling or legislating away the rights of their people at home. In that same perverted institution, they ignore the fundamental rights of the people of Cuba and other communist countries like China, as well as places like Iran, where women are subject to the brutal whims of a dress police. Some in Barbados and the Caribbean still pay lip service to the famous mantra of the father of our independence, Errol Walton Barrow, friends of all, satellites of none. It is a mantra that correlates with the concept of sovereignty. However, sovereignty is a much misunderstood and abused concept because it does not end at the border of the nation state or the outline of a mass of land on a world map. We can call that national or external sovereignty. Sovereignty also applies to all of those living inside the borders of the nation state. What we call the right to freedom, free speech, life, and liberty are all about individual sovereignty. The $64 million question then is this: how much individual sovereignty is worth trading for national sovereignty? Is the external sovereignty of a one-party state worth the individual sovereignty rights of its citizens to freedom of choice, freedom of association, and free speech? It is possible to use a range of analytical tools such as geopolitics, political economy, Marxist theory, and neocommunism to interpret the world in which we live. However, the simplest analytical tool that has withstood and will withstand the test of time is the analytical tool of good versus evil. When the smart mouths and self-appointed philosophers finish asking the perennial academic questions such as who determines what is good or evil, and invoking the concept of moral relativity, some of us still have to exercise simple human compassion and determine that it is wrong or evil for a government to take away the freedom of others, to impose a bloodthirsty religion on its citizens, and to curtail freedom of expression. I am saying all of this so we can try to understand the ongoing engagement and actions of the United States government with Cuba, along with CARICOM, as an attempt to resolve this crisis over Cuba that we have had for quite some time. The expectation is that as a result of these ongoing negotiations mentioned by President Trump, we will see the end of that notorious regime as has been prophesied for some time. Hopefully then, Cuba will become fully integrated back into the free world, build a robust economy, and trade with other nations on an equitable basis. Much more important, however, is the harvest of souls from that country into the eternal kingdom of God as the country once again opens up to the gospel.